everyone. Thanks for joining us today. The topic of today's webcast is top security risks to watch for in shifting to hybrid identity management. Today's webcast is brought to you by Redmond Magazine. It's sponsored by Semperis. I'm Michelle Crockett, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Semperis, and our guest today is Doug Davis, who's our Senior Product Manager. Before we begin, let's go over just a few housekeeping details. First of all, there will be a Q&A session toward the end of the presentation. So as usual, just type any questions that you have in the Q&A box. We'll get to those as we can, and we'll summarize the questions afterward as well. We've got some resources that you can find on the right-hand side of the console, so please check those out. A couple I'd like to bring your attention to in particular is a blog that Doug wrote earlier this year about what to watch out for with managing a hybrid identity system, especially if you're coming from a primarily on-prem AD world. And second, Doug just published in CPO magazine a piece called Understanding the Three Core Security Configurations in Azure Active Directory. So definitely check those out. We've got some other resources in there as well, but these are very focused on Azure Active Directory. The webcast is being recorded, so please keep an eye out for a link in your email so you can rewatch that or share it with a colleague. And then a little bit about the Semperis team. We are the pioneer of identity-driven cyber resilience for cross-cloud and hybrid environments. We provide cyber preparedness, incidents response, and disaster recovery solutions for the entire enterprise's directory services, basically the keys to the kingdom. And our patented technology for Microsoft Active Directory currently protects more than 40 million identities from cyber attacks, data breaches, and operational errors. And now a little bit of background about our speaker today, Doug Davis. Doug is Senior Product Manager at Semperis, and he's heading up our work in the Azure Active Directory space. Previously, he was in product management at Quadratec. He was focused there on collection, storage, securing, and presenting of data within Quadratec's reporting and management tools. Previous to that, Doug's also had other product and business development roles at Ascent and Cogmotive and Dell. So, Doug, welcome today. Azure Active Directory is certainly an increasing topic of interest in the world of security in particular. And I know that you have had some recent chats with Sean Dubey, for example, our Director of Services at Semperis, and we had John Saville at Microsoft, a guest on the show, and you all talked about some of the difference in mindset when you shift from an Azure, when you shift from an on-premise Active Directory security management system to securing Azure Active Directory, and also the complications when you have a hybrid system. So any first takeaways that you'd like to bring out about that discussion, or just some of the challenges?
Yeah, well, thanks. Glad to be here. Looking forward to the next hour or so. And yeah, definitely, this is one of those seismic changes, in our industry. Active Directory is over 20 years old. And, for the majority of us, it's going to be something very new and very different. And what I want to make sure that we go over today, and one of the big takeaways I want you guys to have is that, you do have to change your thinking a little bit, but you have some help along the way. And definitely by the end of this, we'll have a good sense of where things are and where they're going. In particular, we want to talk about three main considerations today. When you're going to Azure Active Directory, you're going from an Active Directory that you kind of know and love and been working on for a while. There's really three things that I kind of always want people to be prepared for, and really three things that you need to kind of address immediately to make sure that you're not opening yourself up for risk. That time when you're the first 6 months are kind of the time you're most at risk because it's new to you. Some of the configuration isn't necessarily locked down by nature. And you really have to think about, the fact that you're in a new authentication model. The perimeter, we're going to talk a lot about perimeter. You might be sick of that word by the end of this presentation, but the perimeter of your network really goes, exponentially outwards, and there's some things you need to consider there. And the way that you approach permissions is very different as well, and we'll talk about those as well. So at the end of this, you'll think about those three core considerations, understand where the risks are, and hopefully be able to move forward and have a great future with Azure Active Directory. Before we get started, I want to get a good sense of where people are in their journey. So if hopefully people are seeing there's a poll on right now, I just want to let you know if you're already in Azure Active Directory today, or if you're planning to go within the next 12 months, or if you're just kicking the tires and as far as you know, there's no plans within the organization to do that. So I'll leave that poll up for about 30 seconds, give everybody some chance to do that. And while you're doing that, one of the things that I'll always sort of, take away when I go into these things is that, really, the way of looking at Azure is not necessarily to think of it as something that's a natural extension of Active Directory, but something that's really totally different, but still not something that you don't need to necessarily be concerned about, because there are a lot of tools, a lot of things that can help you along that path. So definitely, want to give some comfort as well that while there's risk in everything that we do, and increasingly there's a lot of malicious actors out there trying to get into these environments. There are some simple things that you can do and some simple things to be aware of as you do that. So I'll leave this for about another 10 seconds, and then we'll take a look and see where everybody is on their Azure Active Directory journey. Okay, let's take a look at the results. So, so good, healthy amount of you, over half of you already in Azure Active Directory, so that's great. So some of these things won't be too brand new, but still some things we're going to get into. About a quarter of you guys are not in Azure right now, so this will be a great introduction to some of the things to think about. And about 20% of you aren't having any plans to go into Azure, but it'd be good to learn and find out what this is all about. So with that in mind, let's get going and let's dig into Azure Active Directory. The first thing that I want to start out with, and this is something that really is important, and you need to have this at the top of mind throughout your journey with the Azure Active Directory, is that the only thing that these two technologies share is the name Active Directory. So think of Active Directory as a brand name, and it gets applied to in this particular case, two things. Active Directory, just by itself, is the on-premise version of primarily an LDAP-driven directory service that Microsoft's had out there. Domain controllers and all the things that kind of live and breathe under Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is their cloud authentication identity provider that lives in the cloud and does everything up there. And there are very few overlaps from a technology point of view. So let's go into some of those and think about some of the differences. For example, forests. Forests are something that are very familiar on the Active Directory side. There are no forests in Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is a flat infrastructure primarily. There's a few things that you can do that maybe aren't totally flat, but there's no concept of forest. So if you think about that mindset and how you're thinking always in a forest context with an Active Directory, is not in Azure Active Directory. OUs, organizational units, the way you package objects in Active Directory, there's no concept that's similar on the Azure Active Directory side. On the Azure Active Directory side, you'll hear people talking about tenants. Tenants are cloud instances of Azure Active Directory. You can have one or many tenants. Most organizations should, settle on one tenant, but for various reasons, you may have multiple tenants. But every tenant is a separate instance of Azure Active Directory. Now, there's no OUs in Active Directory, but there are administrative groups which allow you to package objects in those. And we'll talk a little bit about those. Instead of having, there's admin groups, in Active Directory and not in Azure Active Directory. What Azure Active Directory has is admin roles. Admin roles allow you to give out, particular level of credentials. And we'll actually go into those in some depth over time. Embedded applications, the Azure Active Directory context can be expanded, and you can add features to it through embedded applications. And we'll talk about that as we go forward. And probably the biggest difference to me, having supported both, is that there are a lot of different versions of Active Directory depending on what version of the domain controllers you have, hot fixes, what versions you're running of some underlying technology. In the cloud, everybody gets the same version. There's anytime that something gets enabled, there might be some rollout differences in some of the services, but the core Azure Active Directory service is always the same, which just means that it's nice as you move from tenant to tenant. So it's a good overall approach to be able to do that. So the main takeaway here is I just want you to think that this is not a simple extension of Active Directory, but a new technology that just shares some of the name of Active Directory. And we'll go into some of these technologies and why they increase your initial risk when you go to Azure Active Directory and what you can do about it. Now, one of the things is that there's a new model for authentication. So, in the typical authentication that you have on Active Directory, you have to have a physical connection to a domain controller. You send a request to a domain controller, it sends it back, and basically everything happens within the context of the physical environment that you have. Moving to cloud authentication requires a very different mindset approach. All the battle scars and concepts on how secure identities and Active Directory, so all the things that you would do and you do on an everyday basis to make sure that Active Directory is secure, none of that applies in Active Directory, Azure Active Directory itself. I've put a link in there, and this presentation will be available where you can get a lot more detail around it. But you have to really understand that you're moving from this physical context to this cloud context, and a lot of different things happen within that particular context. Some things to consider. Now, these are just sort of like starting at, kind of starting at level one, is that there is a very different process to approaching Azure Active Directory. Preparation is always key. And there are a lot of tools, and we'll go into some of those tools later on how to do that. Now, many of you are also using Azure Active Directory without necessarily knowing it. So one of the things that Microsoft does is that they do introduce Azure Active Directory as an identity for things like Teams or Azure Portal. So let's say that you are using some of Azure's other services. So typically you're using Azure Active Directory for something like Office 365 and all those related services. But you may be using it for storage accounts or for SQL servers in the cloud or virtual servers in the cloud. Anytime that you're touching an Azure service, you're having to use an Azure Active Directory identity, and that might just be embedded in your process. So you might already be using Azure Active Directory in the background. If you're using Teams, for example, Teams is available only as a cloud service. Also of particular interest is that Azure Active Directory is used to connect to non-Microsoft SaaS applications, such as Salesforce, for example. It's such a good example of an application that a lot of people will use. And that means that the authentication for some of the access to your directory service itself is now outside of your typical perimeter. And again, we'll talk a little bit further about that as we move on. Now, one of the nice things about Azure Active Directory is that there's a lot of easy configure authentication methods. One of the things that Microsoft is really pushing, and something that could really help with a lot of the challenges around a lot of these malicious attacks, is a concept of passwordless authentication. A password is great in certain contexts, but really the best password is no password at all. And Azure Active Directory is actually moving quite heavily in that by supporting non-password related authentication methods. So if you think about it, Windows Hello for Business is a lot of the, if you have any laptop in the last 4 or 5 years, I think they all have fingerprint authentication. You can set up Azure Active Directory to only accept Windows Hello for Business, which would be through the fingerprint biometrics, using an authenticator app, FIDO key, the physical keys for that. Some of the ways that we do right now when you get a text approach. Now, right now, typically people, when they log into Azure Active Directory, start with a password. So you put a password in, and then because of multi-factor authentication being the de facto standard for Azure Active Directory, another authentication method starts. But it doesn't have to be the password. You can have any mix of these configuration authentication methods and bypass the password completely. And Microsoft is starting to push quite heavily to move a good proportion of their Azure Active Directory tenants into passwordless authentication. And some newer technology they put out, like what if you do lose some of your access to one of your authentication method? There's a temporary access key that your administrator can give to you that gives you a password that you, for a very short period of time, to get around that. This type of configuration is not easy on Active Directory. Active Directory is kind of, all these things have to be kind of cobbled together in a sense to be able to do that. Whereas in Azure Active Directory, all these authentication methods are available and have a high degree of configurability within your environment. Okay, so let's talk a little about the perimeter, the Active Directory perimeter versus the Azure Active Directory perimeter. So I think of Active Directory as a kind of castle with a moat, with a single drawbridge to get down there, and you do have a lot of control over how you want to be able to get into that particular environment. Now, Azure Active Directory is still very much a controlled access area, but there's a lot of layers. There's a lot of doors. Each one of those doors has to be protected. And like any, if you think of any siege movie that you've ever watched in the past, one door gets broken open and the whole thing is made available. And you really have to change your mindset on how you're looking at it and consider that the perimeter, while still very protected, has a lot more doors. You could physically put a domain controller in a room, close it up, have a switch that only has certain IP addresses that go to that. That concept is much harder to configure in the Azure Active Directory world. There's a business reason for doing it that way, because as we move into the cloud and all the business benefits of doing that, but you have to think about that. And I'll tell you about a very particular scenario that I think people are underestimating sometimes when they think about Azure Active Directory. So Active Directory revolves around the domain controller. That can be protected in situ. It's physically there. It's something that you can do that. Azure Active Directory revolves around the cloud. It is optimized. It is designed and configured to give access to everyone from everywhere. So you're going from a very typical mindset where you're kind of protecting this fortress domain controller and its inherent services, going to something where that kind of concept of protection ceases to exist, in the sense that you can't control how many access points are out to the cloud. Now, if you've been spending, some of us spend 20, 25 years in the Active Directory space, this is a tremendous adjustment. And you have to change what you're actually doing, guarding against. So you're guarding against an endless scope of possible entry points, but that is also its advantage as well. I'll talk a little bit about that later on, because one of the things about having multiple tenants under management, which Microsoft does, is they can send protection around between those. So you have this kind of duopoly of yes, you're in the cloud, your perimeter is endless, but that perimeter is not just protected by you. There's some things that you can do, and there's things that the vendor, Microsoft, will do as well to protect you. And we've had some great real-world examples of how that's worked. Now, one of the things one of those perimeter entry points is Active Directory. Active Directory connects into Azure Active Directory through Active Directory Connect, and they start synchronizing. So one of those attack vectors, which there is nothing in Azure to be able to protect it, because everything that's outside of Azure has its own layer of protection, is Active Directory. And Semperis has been in that space for years now, and we have some of the greatest minds working on that. And if you want to protect that particular side of it, so one of the takeaways here is make sure you start protecting all these other entry points. Take a look at a tool that we put out called Purple Knight. It's a fantastic tool that allows you just go to the site, install it, run it, and it'll give you great insight into how secure your environment is, a whole bunch of security indicators around, what your Active Directory configuration is. Are you vulnerable to some of these attacks? What you can do. And really, even if, you think you've spent a lot of time, and we've had a lot of experience with sending Purple Night out to some of our longtime customers, and they go, wow, this is great. This really gives us a lot of insight. Because what we've done is we've thought a lot about how do we present the complexity of these security risks within Active Directory in a methodology and a user experience that you can really sink your teeth into. So when we talk about protecting all those perimeter points, Active Directory is one of those. Take a look at Purple Night. You do yourself a favor, and it really will allow you to at least understand that part of the perimeter Active Directory coming into Azure Active Directory, which is a very popular attack vector. You'll have some good clarity on how you can secure that and get started on your journey of managing security on that side as well. So I want to talk about how the perimeter extends. So, when you go into Azure, you log into Azure Active Directory, there are a number of services and elements that are underneath that. The majority of those are Microsoft services, and we'll talk about some of those later on. But Azure is made to be an extensible framework, and Microsoft has made it available to third-party vendors such as ourselves or thousands of other third-party vendors out there to be able to build tools that will embed themselves and extend the capability of your Azure Active Directory. So, for example, sales tools such as Salesforce, productivity tools, Monday.com, Bamboo HR, management tools like some of the stuff that's going to be coming out from Semperis. All of these have specific tasks that they need to do, specific levels. And if you've ever seen the dialog on the right, which says permissions requested, every one of these third-party tools will reach out into Azure and say, you know what, I want to do some really cool stuff, but I need certain rights to have them. And you're going to be asked to approve those rights. And if you approve those rights, you're basically giving the application the ability to access Azure within those particular permission, that particular permission that you've given to them, and they could read information, write information. They can almost replicate everything that you would do as administrator within that. So there's two takeaways here. One is that you do need to pay attention to these dialogues. I think these dialogues sometimes come up and go by, and Microsoft did used to, allow people to self-register these and kind of bypass some of the administrative access. You still set up your Azure like that if you want to, but increasingly, we need to have administrative consent for that. But even an administrator often will not understand the underlying complexity of the permission model that's coming up. So a permission request pops up. It's a long list of things that this application needs to have. You're actually granting that third party access as a route down into into your Azure Active Directory tenant via these permissions. I'll give you an example. So here's your tenant. It's very well managed, and everything is happening within there. You've set everything up. And then somebody from finance comes along and says, you know what, we've just signed up a new payroll application. It's really easy for us to use within Azure Active Directory. If we put it in Azure Active Directory, we can leverage some of our own storage accounts. We can leverage our identities. We can get our contracts. It's going to make payroll that much easier. So can we get this application installed in our environment? So the third party will ask for an application to be installed in your Active Directory, your Azure Active Directory tenant. That third party will have a specific set of rights into your tenant. And if one of those rights is read rights, most likely they will, put that data into a third-party database. And let's say that database it's a payroll application. So that database is a database of everybody's names, phone numbers, social insurance numbers, everything that they would need for payroll. You've protected your own environment, to the ninth degree. Everything is really well, but your data has now outside of your Azure tenant. So your perimeter is actually outside of that. So malicious actors will come and target the third-party vendor to get to your data. So how well do you know that third-party vendor? And now, your perimeter is basically not only your own tenant, but that third-party application as well. If you go into your portal.azure.com and take a look at your application registrations, you might see a lot of these third-party vendors. And that means that if you have data or access, or let's say that you have write rights, so that third-party application has been given write rights to the application. And again, there's probably a strong business reason for do that. You should choose your third-party vendors carefully, but maybe they write back things like some information around salaries or something like that. If a malicious actor gets into the third-party application, then they actually have gotten into your tenant as well. This sounds a lot scarier than actually is, because you can do a lot of things to protect that. But the biggest thing you have to do is you have to understand the applications that are in your environment, start to understand what rights have been given, and revoke those rights if you're uncomfortable with it. This is your tenant, and you can do that. But this is one of the things that you really have to take account. I have to say that when we do some of our initial security assessments on Azure implementations, we take a look at these applications. And sometimes it was just something somebody tried. Although I was doing a trial of a particular software, it asked for these permissions. We never cleaned it up. When's the last time that you actually reviewed all your applications and be able to go through them? So be able to do that is one of the big risks early on in getting there. The third one is really around the permission model. And the permission model is really how you lock things down. So first of all, if we kind of go back, that authentication model is different. So you want to be able to take advantage of all the new authentication models. You want to be able to understand what your real perimeter is. The perimeter is larger than it was previously, and make sure you take into account those third-party applications. And then you want to start understanding the permission model. And again, this is a place where we often go into Azure environments, and we see that there's not a very good understanding of what the permission model is, mostly because it can be very, very complicated. And oftentimes we're not fully aware of what we're actually giving out to people. Now, on premises, mostly because it's been around for a long time as well, but it's fairly easy to control who has physical access to the main controllers, and the overall management entry points are well defined and documented. The various security groups and ACLs and ACEs and all the things that kind of permeate throughout Active Directory. In a hybrid environment where Azure Active Directory is involved as well, these identities are also now stored in the cloud, built anybody has access to the internet. And suddenly administrators who had this very closed, well-defined methodology to do permissions are dealing with an inherently open model for initial access connections, larger number of services, roles, permissions, has a significant impact on risk. And really, you have to be able to get a handle of it fairly quickly, or you're going to start having, a lot of challenges with that. One of the things I always say is that people really need to understand roles. Roles are basically what things can people do within an organization. And again, if you take a look at your own list of roles, you'll probably see some roles that don't even make any sense. Microsoft kind of creates a whole bunch of roles for very specific scenarios. But there are some roles that are heavily leveraged, okay? And you absolutely need to have some global administrators. You should always have at least 2 global administrators, because if your global administrator leaves, or if you can't get into that one account, you need another account to get into that. But you have to control it. Don't have any more than 5. These are the people that can do anything. But then there are some other powerful roles which are very close to global administrators that often people don't take a look. So, for example, application administrators. This is somebody that you've assigned within your organization to manage those applications, third-party applications coming in. They could easily get access to a third-party tool to have right access to everything. Cloud application administrator is very similar to application administrator. There's very little difference between those two. Exchange administrator, just managing your mail. Privileged role administrator, that's somebody who's, again, very close to global administrator because they're basically able to manage the roles that give out privileges. So you want to be able to do that. User access administrator, SharePoint administrator. If you go, there's a tax simulator administrator, there's B2C administrator, there's all kinds of roles that do that. So you want to be able to say, and you should reduce the number of roles that you have. A lot of these roles have overlapping permissions. And you might not always be aware that somebody has more rights than they actually need. So probably one best way to approach this is to reduce the number of roles that you actually have. There's some roles that are out there that people don't actually often use and aren't aware that people are been given, but actually end up giving a lot of rights. And sometimes they're just sort of, I don't really know that much about that role. Guest inviter is one that it's a very specific role. It just allows you to invite guests, but you can invite anybody, and you can basically allow the access within to the environment to anybody outside. Directory writers, write into your directory and be able to change that. Password administrator, the compliance administrator can read all the security settings, understand what that is. So people typically do try to kind of control what they have from the perspective of the global administrator and some of those close roles that are close to that. But a compliance administrator is a very powerful role that allows me, if you gave that to me, I could find out all the security setting of your environment, how compliant you are, and find exactly where the potential risks are. If you go into that particular link that I put in there, you'll see all the built-in roles, and there are a lot of them. There's also the other challenge that you can create custom roles if you have a P1 or P2 license. And that really extends the complexity as well, because if you create a role that doesn't have some very, very well-defined terminology, or just sort of put it out there as a concept, you do need to be able to kind of make sure that you are creating those in particular. But you may want to create a role because there is a large list of permissions in Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, sorry. And, you might want to have very granular ones, say, I'm going to create a role that just allows me to do one specific thing, and that's the right that I want to give out to. And if you think about some of the delegated approach that we want to do things, it's often nice to have that. But keep an eye on your roles and how they're being used. Microsoft did introduce something called administrative units that allow you to, so these roles tend to be kind of permeate throughout the entire environment. But what if you just want to give somebody access to a very specific subset of objects? Administrative units are a way to do that. Again, they're very easy to create. If you go into your Azure Active Directory tools, you'll see an administrative unit option there. I can then create an administrative unit and assign it particular roles, and those are the roles that I've defined. So, a group administrator, a license administrator. Let's say group administrator is a pretty good one. Let's say I want to create something just for Germany, for the help desk that's there. I create an administrative unit called Germany Help Desk. I then put in a particular couple of users that I can do in there, and I can just manage groups for those particular people. So administrative units are a great way to reduce the amount of roles. So if you're giving roles out to a lot of people and you're starting to see that your roles are getting quite complex, you can actually take a step back and then start putting those into administrative units themselves. So let's take a review here. So, we want you to leverage a lot of these authentication models and availability that's there. You want to be able to, understand the actual perimeter of your environment. It probably, if you're in a hybrid environment, it will include Active Directory. It will include third-party tools. And you want to be able to manage permissions inherently with roles and administrative units. So that's your job. You take that approach, how you authenticate, what the perimeter is, and what the permission model is. But you're not just doing these things on your own. And actually, one of the great things about being in the cloud is that Microsoft has the ability to push people in the right direction from security context, and as well fix problems immediately. So let's say there's a very serious Active Directory issue, and all the domain controllers have a security risk that's available. What do you have to do? You have to get a hot fix. You got to go through it and manually do that for every domain controller that you have. That takes time. That takes effort. Microsoft has the ability to basically, know that once there is a known vulnerability in any of their cloud tenants, they'll evaluate that and then they'll spread it out to all of those. They also make sure that there are things that you can actually just turn on. So there's something called security defaults, and if you're new, so that 25% of people, or 50% actually of people on this webinar that haven't been in Azure Active Directory yet, when you go and create your new tenant, the security defaults are turned on automatically. So first of all, it requires that all users have to register for Azure Active Directory multi-factor authentication. The MFA uptake on Active Directory on-premise is still shockingly low, anywhere from, I've seen things as high as 60-70% of on-premise environments are not using multi-factor authentication. Probably the best way to stop a malicious attack. New tenants are required to have multi-factor authentication enabled, and you can also, for old tenants, just go and turn on all the security defaults as well. In particular, requires administrators to perform multi-factor authentication, so there's registration for it and then actually requiring it. Blocking legacy activities like access to Azure portal, requiring that there is a deep level of access in there. There's a lot of other things that are in there as well. Microsoft also gives you technology like Secure Score and some of the compliance tools to be able to go through some of those as well. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the scenarios that we've seen, where new threats are often automatically controlled within that. So Microsoft doesn't put out numbers on how many tenants they have throughout their environment, but they're in the hundreds of thousands of tenants right now. And somebody gets into there's a lot of different attack vectors that could potentially be leveraged. Somebody finds one, it gets in there. Microsoft becomes aware of it. They have a huge amount of analytics that happens in the background. They apply that fix to the compromised tenant. They figure out that, that's exactly what was causing the problem. Now that fix is then copied to all other tenants as well, and it gets propagated throughout the cloud. So, when you think about how this was happening on the domain controller side, you now have a very nice way of just not having to necessarily worry about it yourself, but being copied over very quickly from Microsoft. Microsoft does get very quick on some of these. The other thing that really is important to understand is the impact of licensing on what you get. Whereas every version of Azure Active Directory is the same, the number of services that are turned on and off are different depending on the level of license you have. And you may have heard of these. There's business premium. At the enterprise level, there's E3, E5, P1, P2. E5 is really where Microsoft gives you the most services for that. And if you take a look, this is kind of their matrix of security within the cloud services, and where third-party vendors help, within particular sides of it. So you'll see things here like classification services, governance, key management, endpoint protection, anomaly detection, risk and threat analysis. All of these things are happening on the background on a continual basis, and you'll often find that they will feed in through. But you have to be very careful and make sure that you have certain levels. So, for example, the ability to create custom roles may make a lot of sense in your organization to be able to push through a particular level of permissions. You may want to create that. You'll need at least a P1 or a P2 license for that. A lot of these advanced services are definitely in the E5 license model, but again, you have to decide yourself, what's the cost benefit analysis between a lower priced model to a higher priced model. And also, there's a lot that you can add, and there's a lot of third-party tools that can augment a lot of these capabilities. You can get away with an E3 license, for example, if you want something a little bit more advanced than some of the Microsoft offerings that are out there. And that's basically how we kind of want to get you to get started. So think a lot about the perimeter in particular, and if you look at everything that's in the cloud, is protected from a cloud perspective. So whatever you have still on the Active Directory side still continues to work. And as I said before, Purple Knight is probably the best tool to get started with that. So, we have a nice tool to be able to do that. So, if you do anything else after this presentation, go out, take a look at Purple Knight and start seeing how it can work with your environment. Purple Knight really kind of starts your journey into some of these more powerful tools to be able to manage Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. And after your Purple Knight journey, really you kind of can go into some of our more advanced technologies, like our Data Directory Services Protector, which is really a comprehensive Active Directory and soon Azure Active Directory comprehensive security tool that allow you to really understand what's happening, get prepared before there's attack, understand what's happening during attack, and what to do after the attack to be able to bring this back. I think if one of the most it's unfortunate, but we're kind of living in an age where various people, for whatever reason, feel that it's part of what they want to do is to get into as many environments as they can. And collectively, if we all increase and improve our ability to secure against these, once they they'll always go for the easier targets. Once they run out of easy targets, maybe they'll move on to something else. So a tool like DSP can augment your ability to understand what's happening on your Active Directory and Azure Active Directory side and give you this ability to completely always understand what's happening within your environment. And let's say something does happen and you do actually end up, having a challenge. It is very difficult to be able to get back on your own, and that's where our Active Directory Forest recovery, and we will be highlighting some Azure Active Directory capabilities in this space soon as well, really allows you to take proactive ability to get back on your feet in the shortest possible time. So it's really nice from that perspective. Whoops, sorry, I wasn't pretending there.
And Doug, one of the things I wanted to point out about Purple Knight, too, which you might touch on, is you get a scorecard after you run it, and it evaluates your security posture in 5 different areas, including Kerberos, AD delegation, account security, AD infrastructure, group policy. So it really gives you a nice overview, but it also tells you where you can dive in. And there are a few indicators that are considered critical. And so if you're, just need to know where to prioritize this report that you get really helps you understand that.
Yeah. It's really an amazing tool. And really, it's one of those tools that you're proud to be part of as well, because, you just see it, it really exceeded our expectations when it started getting out there and people started using it. So, yeah. So yeah, for some reason my slides weren't going ahead for a while, but yeah, I talked about DSP and Active Directory Forest recovery. And at the end of the day, you want to be able to, work, as part of a community and trying to get things, controlled and back on their feet if you have any challenges as well. So we'll wrap this up a little bit before we start the Q&A. But so the takeaway here again is, and I think we've hammered this home fairly nicely, is that you have a lot of new options and capabilities from an authentication point of view. I would almost say if you're new to Azure Active Directory, start passwordless. If you can get rid of password, if you remember that chart that we showed, it has low security. Passwords are the easiest thing to get into. And if you can get away with that and get to go to passwordless, you'll definitely increase your security exponentially just from that. The temporary access key and new technology from Microsoft allows you to do that more effectively right now. Understand that the perimeter is not just you and your Azure tenant; it's all the applications that have access to it as well. And take a look at roles and administrative units and how they're actually used to be able to get into that. So I'm going to I want to talk a little. Get one more poll in here just to see where you are from the perspective of, because it's going to be interesting to see where this goes as an industry in the next little while, to see if we're going to have people that are going 100% Azure Active Directory, 100% staying 100% on premises, or going to a hybrid model. Hybrid model is really what we're seeing, but we keep wanting to get data points for that. So I'll leave this up on the screen for a few minutes, not a few minutes, a few seconds, and then we'll start wrapping things up with some questions.
If you've already answered the poll and you have a question, just make sure you drop it in that Q&A panel. We've got a few to get through while we wait for those poll results. Be dropping those questions.
I'll give you guys about 10 more seconds. Okay, let's see what we got. So, wow. So hybrid is the way to go. It's interesting. Hybrid has its own challenges, but it still seems to be the best of all possible paths at the moment. Microsoft is pushing very hard for 100% on-premises as Active Directory. They see that as the future, but just because they think it's the future doesn't mean that we're going to be all convinced that's the way to go. Hybrid does have some key still some key capabilities that make it looks like the path that everybody wants to go moving forward. So that's great, because what we're from a Semperis point of view, we're looking at the hybrid model as the de facto standard for at least the next 5 years or so, while people get more comfortable with Azure Active Directory. So okay, well, appreciate that for your time. And Michelle, did you want me to go through the questions, or will you pass them to me?
I can queue those up. So one that came in was we have an administrator account. We have administrator account separate from our everyday user account. What is the best practice for administering Azure? Should we be logging in with our domain accounts or with our regular accounts? So
I tend to say you should always use your regular user accounts. You probably don't. I mean, there's different takes on that. I mean, I think if you're careful, you can be either way. But usually, you want to be able. So, what I've seen is people are. They forget which one they're logged into. So they have an admin account and a user account. And actually, we've worked at a couple of organizations where we've been kind of like working them to get rid of their admin account. The admin accounts start being shared, which is never very good either. But it is a choice type of approach. But I would say use your user accounts, because then you could move people back and forth between tasks. And when that person leaves, you absolutely know that their access is being revoked versus an admin account from that perspective. So right. That would be my take on that one. Yeah.
Right. And there's a lot of native admin tools out there. Are there some that you would recommend to start using right away?
So probably Secure Score is a great one. Compliance Center. So one of the challenges of Azure Active Directory is that you do have to go into the Azure Active Directory portal, and so there's two challenges there. One is there's a lot of admin centered. There's a lot of, it looks like similar components, but you actually switch. Microsoft changes it all the time as well. So oftentimes you'll go into the Compliance Center and say, oh no, now that's over at the Security Center. But you do want to look at your Secure Score. So that's one tool you want to look at. You want to go into your applications. So there's application registrations and enterprise applications. Those are two UIs that people tend to ignore, but they're actually pretty pretty relevant. If you want to know exactly what has access to your environment outside of your own accounts and folks that are within your organization, take a look at application registrations. Those are applications that have that you've registered and given access to. And enterprise applications, which are applications that have come in and you've given permission to them. So go look at those. There's a lot around logging. If you go to the audit logs, a native tool, make sure your audit logs are turned on. You go there, you don't see anything in your directory logs or your sign-in logs. Sign-in logs are another great thing that are there. Make sure they're turned on. Make sure that user risk policies are turned on. So really, there's almost too many to name in a sense, but take a look at some of these kind of maybe deeper ones around things like turning policies on, enterprise and app registrations, and compliance and secure score. These are great ones to start with.
Great. Next up, can FIDO2 security key and OAuth hardware token be used with Azure AD?
Yep, FIDO2 I know for sure there's support for. Just going to see if there's, it is part of that passwordless sign-in. So you have to have a Windows 10 device. I'm just looking at it quickly here. But yeah, those are available within Azure Active Directory, and they are some of those, some of those default authentication models that you can leverage as your part of Azure.
Great. And then another question, can I review my registered applications and revoke any permissions they may have?
Absolutely. That's something that's actually an important concept, because people think that just because you've granted permission, to an application, you can't, take it out on your own. If you go into your app registrations, and it's kind of like, if you go through Task Manager, you see services that you don't understand. If you go into your portal.azure.com, and then go into Azure Active Directory, look at application registrations, look at that list. If there's one that you don't know what it is, doesn't seem to make any sense, you can revoke the permission, you can delete it, whatever you want to do with that. You might have to do some due diligence and make sure that you're there, that you find out what it is that's driving it, and usually I'll tell you who the vendors is. But yeah, you don't have to wait for the application to take you through the process of revoking those permissions. You can do it yourself as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Doug. So I think we're about out of time. Let's just review a little bit the resources that we have for you today. So check out, again, the download for Purple Night. There's a couple of content pieces from Doug, a blog that was published earlier this year, and then one that's hot off the presses with CPO Magazine about the 3 important security configurations in Azure Active Directory. So check out those resources. Thank you, Doug, for the presentation today. Very much appreciate this. This is sponsored by Semperis and Redmond Magazine. Doug, any parting comments about securing Azure Active Directory before we go?
No, except education is always the best tool. Microsoft documentation is copious and remarkably clear. So, use this just as a jumping off point, and dig deep into some of the, the overview documentation to get yourself off on the right path.
Great. Thanks for the insight. Thanks, everyone, for attending today, and we'll see you next time.